Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this session in which we're going to be talking about the world's biggest democracy, India. India, of course, is where Julia is our bureau chief in Delhi. Talk about location, location, location. It is flanked by China just over the Himalayas, and to the west, Pakistan, with whom India has fought 3 wars since independence in 1947. Indian voters this year catapulted into power Narendra Modi, who is arguably India's most controversial politician and who promised to raise India's economic and strategic standing. Modi is a Hindu nationalist who ran the state of Gujarat when riots erupted there in 2002, riots that killed mostly Muslims. We have a terrific panel this afternoon to provide insights into this sprawling story that is India. I can assure you that as we have been sitting here, in the time that we have been sitting here, they have all forgotten more about India than I have ever known in my life, such is their expertise. I want to introduce them, starting with our guest who's in the other time zone at the other end of the stage. That's Ashley Tellis, who is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington. Over the course of his career, he served in the State Department, on the National Security Council staff, where he was intimately involved, at State actually, in negotiating the civil nuclear agreement with India. And Professor Ashutosh Varshney of Brown University is sitting next to Ashley. He's written extensively about Hindu-Muslim relations. He has served on Kofi Annan's Millennium Task Force on Poverty and also as an advisor to the World Bank. And he is a contributing editor to Indian Express, where you can read his columns online, as I have been doing. We had one cancellation. Economist Arvind Subramanian of the Peterson Institute for International Economics was going to join us, but last month he was named Chief Economic Advisor to the government of India by Prime Minister Modi. I consider this a tribute to NPR's bookers that they were ahead of the Prime Minister on that trail. But with the economy of India on his plate and the need for some discretion, he had to pass up our panel this afternoon. We're going to hear first from my friend of many years and colleague Julie McCarthy, who was NPR's Islamabad bureau chief in Pakistan before she crossed the border into India 2.5 years ago. In fact, India, this is your 6th posting overseas. I figured you needed 5 before you were ready for India?
Yeah, I think so. I found it to be greatly reassuring that I had basically seen the world before I arrived in India, because it was the complexities and the ambiguities and the contradictions you find in some pockets of the world, but not all in one place the way you do in India. So it was a great primer. I feel very honored, actually, and I need to thank the people here. This is my 20th year overseas. And as I say, India is the latest incarnation, the 6th, and I have to thank you all for making that possible, for us to deliver for 20 years stories that spanned many continents. So thank you very much for that.
How would you describe the difference between covering India and covering Pakistan?
I am going to rise and answer that question,
Good.
Robert.
We'll go for it.
We're going to rise and go to the podium, because I control the clicker. And I have to see it. The difference, I suppose, most graphically and easily between Pakistan and India, how do you cover one and then the other, is that in Pakistan there's a streamlined quality to the coverage. It's a bit more straightforward in its theme. There's one dominant narrative, and that is conflict. And I don't care if it's a story about music or fashion or the changing seasons. Somehow conflict finds its way into the narrative of your story about Pakistan. But it was a terrific primer for crossing the border into India, where there's not one narrative, there's 16 different narratives. There's the whole question of, as we're going to be discussing here, the transformation of India right now. That's a huge narrative. There's social transformation, there's social dislocation, there's political shifts and a huge generational shift. This is a very young country. 65% of India is 35 and under. So there's all this generational swirl happening. There's mega corruption stories that need to be contended with. There is the story of big business. This is Asia's third largest economy. There's religious strife. There's climate change. And then there is, for many of us, for me certainly, the huge questions of human dignity and social justice. And they come in many forms, from poisonous school lunch programs to dangerously poor hospitals to violence against women. So India is this virtual fire hydrant of news coming at you constantly, very different from, in a different array from Pakistan. So you have to be selective about how you're going to cover the vastness of this. There's not enough time, there's not enough airtime, there's not enough hours in the day to try to get it all in, particularly when you have this hypermedia coming at you, which is India, this 24-hour news cycle, which makes stubbing a toe seem urgent. It's that hyper-competitive media. So to be selective, you have to be selective. So I am going to be selective here as we take up some themes, and I want to distill some big social themes for you here, and I'm going to ask you to think about three numbers: 5%, 600 million, and once every 20 minutes. 5%, 600 million, and once every 20 minutes. Now, India's 5%. 4.6% of Indians tell census takers in 2011 that they are the lucky ones. They own 4 things. They own a TV, they own a telephone, they own a vehicle, and they own a computer. So the question comes, if that's the 5%, that's the lucky 5%, this will give you an understanding of where the country really is. That mustard colored is the 95% who don't have those 4 things. They may have 3 of them, they may have 2 of them, they may have 1 of them. So you see this huge disparity here. And the Indian economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen says this sort of distribution of growth looks to him, makes India look like islands of California in a sea of sub-Saharan Africa. That's quite an image when you think about it. Islands of California in a sea of sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit mirrored in that map. And this graph shows you the distance that India has got to travel to lift that 95% up to out of poverty, the distance it must travel to be competitive with China. And what this graph tells you from the World Bank is that 33% of the world's extreme poor, the poorest people in the world, 1/3 of them live in India. 1/3 lives in India. 13% live in China. So the challenge for the Modi government, you can see, is enormous. They're under great pressure to change those numbers, to get competitive, to find jobs for the millions of people who are entering the job market every year and don't have jobs. So growth is a big story, and one we'll get to, as well as the India-China comparison that may be a little inapt. But there is there's something on the positive ledger here, of course. It's India. It's optimistic, it's aspirational. And one of these aspirational icons is the fact that there are 800 million cell phones, 800 mobile phones in India. And increasingly, they're smartphones. And you can, because the technology is getting so good and so cheap, millions of people, tens of millions, arguably hundreds of millions of people could have access to a smartphone for $50. And what does that do? It can transform the way people teach, the way they conduct commerce, the way they solve problems, the way they farm, the way they make things, the way they innovate. But now comes one of India's most complex contradictions. While millions have access to technology, vast numbers of poor lack access to even the most basic amenities. Remember that 600 million figure I asked you to keep in mind. Here's why. 600 million Indians have no access to something as basic as a toilet. It's a daily obstacle for half of that enormous country. It's as if 600 million Indians lived in the 19th century. And we're talking about the challenges of India that lives in various centuries. The 19th, the 20th, and 21st. Parts of India live in all three of these places. And Modi has promised to change this picture. He's come along and said, more toilets, fewer temples, or toilets now, temples later. And if he does this one thing, for a vast number of people, he will have succeeded in office. If he can change that public health menace, and that's part of the problem, it's not viewed as a public health menace. If he can do that, he will have succeeded in office for a great number of people. But imagine that you're a pregnant woman. Now, I know that's difficult for the men in the audience, but imagine you're a pregnant woman and you've got to answer the call of nature. Where do you go? You go outside. You're ill, you're infirmed, you're old, and you have to relieve yourself outdoors. One woman said to me in one village, now imagine all of that in the middle of the monsoons. And she hiked her skirt up to show me where the water level comes and how the gymnastics that she goes through to try to relieve herself. So, this is it's a stunning fact, and it's something we just take for granted, which is something we've talked about here today. And I think the story and what makes India urgent to me is I feel that it is a moral challenge to the world to understand what that means, and to grapple with it and to try to find solutions. And we were talking earlier about the Gates Foundation comes along and they're trying to reinvent the toilet. Well, what does that mean? It's a huge project, and it's a huge, you're changing the lives of people. You're uplifting people's lives over something that we don't really think about very much. Now, the women forced to defecate outdoors told me they were scared to do this. They were scared of attacks, of four-legged beasts, of snakes, of men who would leer at them and at times attack them. And they have this great risk to contend with this simple function. Again, something we don't even think about. So I thought that was a compelling story. And here are women in a village who were so grateful to get decent sanitation for their children who get cognitively stunted in this open defecation situation. They were so grateful to have toilets put in their village, and so grateful for their own safety that they broke out in song when we were there to honor the social entrepreneur who had come in to deliver these to them. And his name is Bindeshwar Pathak. And he installed this sanitation for free. Now, this story lit up on Twitter, and I think it lit up on Twitter because the fact of it is so stunning. 600 million people in one country, half a nation, has no access to basic facilities. And I think also is that we think of the burdens that people have to endure, particularly the hundreds of millions of women, and what the anxiety it produces. And we did a story on it, and I think we'll pick it up there. Again, women who were in a village here, they're singing the praises of this man. This is Mr. Pathak, a social entrepreneur who had brought this miracle to their village as far as they were concerned. And we'll play the tape. Listen to the story.
Each of the 144 households has been outfitted in this village, a village Pata calls a pathfinder.
To show the entire nation that you should have toilets in your house, and here nobody goes outside. This is the beauty of this village.
The women of Hirmatla village literally sing the praises of the 71-year-old Pathak, whose lowly toilet has become a tool of social change. Their song is about a wife's plea for a toilet. In rural India, households that can afford to build a latrine often don't. Resident Sheila Nahalia says her husband refused because of the expense. So Nahalia stitched clothes to raise $50, her family's portion of the cost, and a small fortune for her. 35-year-old Vijay Lakshmi smiles radiantly and says she and her children have never been healthier. Lakshmi says that there has been a huge change in our lives. Before, the men would follow us, wait for us to sit in the field and watch. Now, thanks to Mr. Pathak, she says, we have a lavatory at home and we feel better. Lakshmi adds, our dignity, which is an ornament for us, is now safe.
I love that image, your dignity as an ornament. In India, so much is about dignity, it's about honor, it's about dishonor. And when a woman is attacked, sexually attacked in India, often she is seen as the one who has brought dishonor on the family. So you have the victimization all over again of someone who has been attacked. So safety, as you can see from going out into a field to an ordinary urban dweller, safety for women is an enormous issue. And I'm sure many of you recall the enormous story from a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, after the gang rape of a young woman in Delhi on a bus. Sexual crimes against women stirred an international outcry and a soul searching inside of India. Let's hit this. And what do you see here? Every 20 minutes, a woman is allegedly raped or reportedly raped in India. And that number is accelerating. Why is the number accelerating? Is the reporting better? Do they feel more confidence to come to the police, who have oftentimes ridiculed them, turned them away, and ignored their pleas? So why are the numbers up? And they're up quite dramatically. As you can see, let's see, 33,000, up 34% in 1 year. Is that the effect of that December rape? It's a question to be looked at. And the offenders are getting younger. This is something that really distresses India. One of the rapists, the convicted rapists, was a 17-year-old. And the courts had to try him as an adolescent. And so these cases raise all sorts of questions in India about what is justice. Sometimes it takes years to get a conviction, and the conviction rate is 24%, which means 3/4 of people are walking away from these things unscathed. So there's questions of justice, how to get justice. What is justice? Is the death penalty justice, which is where the whole incident in December of 2012 led India. Depending on the circumstances, you could get the death penalty for rape in India. But I think what's really important here is that all of those numbers need to be put into a global perspective, a global context. You can see from this, the FBI tells us that in the United States, forcible rape happens every 6 minutes. Every 6 minutes in this country. So we have to ask ourselves, is Steubenville that different from Delhi on a cold December night on a bus? This is a global menace. And it is not an Indian phenomenon, and I think what happened as a result of that heinous crime 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago, is this sensation fixed in the mind of many people that India was unique here, that India was the outlier. India, in my estimation, and I think this is an incredibly important thing to talk about in terms of clarity and fairness in the coverage of India, it needs to be understood that India stands as a metaphor. It's not an outlier, as these figures show you. Once every 6 minutes, once every 20 minutes. It's certainly not a contest. It lets you know that there is violence against women globally. It is a global phenomenon. Alongside the sex crimes, there, of course, is gender discrimination, and it is deeply ingrained in India. I was talking to a director in Bollywood, and I found this to be a stunning story. A director in Bollywood just a couple of weeks ago, and she told me this story of how they had to smuggle onto the set of a movie a female makeup artist. And I said, why? What are you talking about? She said, oh, it's illegal. You can't have female makeup artists in Bollywood. It's the purview of the men. The unions have decreed this. The men need the jobs. It's actually a law. You can dress hair. You can be a hairdresser on a set of a Bollywood movie, but you cannot put on makeup. So this very week, lo and behold, the Supreme Court came along and said women can finally be makeup artists. That's a big step in India. And as one justice put it, we're not in 1935, we're in 2014. Again, the challenges of the centuries. He's trying to drag a mentality into the 21st century. But again, we're in India, and contradictions abound about sexuality, certainly. There was recently a Bangalore techie. He was an IT man whose wife, very upset about the marriage, discovered he was having an affair with another man. She videotaped it, and she took it to the police. Now under Indian law, he could very well wind up in jail. He could wind up in prison, because homosexuality is a criminal offense in India. And just very recently, within this year, the Supreme Court said that this 150-year-old law applies to such a small segment of the society that very few people will be aggrieved, and therefore we will let it stand. So you see, we will let it stand. Now, the same country that gives you transgender as a third gender this year, that was a constitutional mandated category created for discrimination, gives you transgender, makes homosexuality a criminal offense. So you've got all sorts of contradictions and ambiguities, and which century do we want to live in, and where are we? So what is India? Again, this whole question of how do you define India? I'd like to close with a story about Indian exceptionalism in the 21st century. With all of its earthbound problems, India has sent a mission to Mars, which is rather extraordinary. And this is a picture of what the orbiter, this is a picture of Mars that the orbiter has sent back. It was just sent up in September, 2 days before the US Maven arrived. And this really speaks to the idea of more than one India. You know, you can have people millions who can languish in poverty on the one hand, and yet you will have highly trained aerospace engineers and scientists who can launch a spaceship to Mars and put India in a very elite club. And what struck listeners about this fact and about the story of the Mars mission, India's Mars mission, was the price tag, how cheaply they had done it. And I'm going to play you a clip of tape from that story. I'm going to ask the engineer if you can boost this a bit, because we know it's a little low. This is a story of how India does things. Yes, it sends a mission to Mars on the cheap, and how exactly? What's happening inside the society that allows that? So let's give a listen.
India went to Mars for around $70 million. That's less than it cost to make the $100 million space thriller Gravity.
And there are many Indians who will say, why are you spending so much money? $70 million is too much.
That's engineering professor Radham Narasimha, the former head of the National Aerospace Lab. He says amortized over the life of the program, it cost each of India's 1.2 billion people about 2 cents a year, or the cost of a cup of roadside tea once every 3 years.
That is my argument with the Indians who say this is a waste of money.
The World Bank says more than 250 million Indians live on $1.25 a day. But Professor Narasimha says India can afford to explore deep space thanks to the improvisation of its scientists. Indians compressed their effort to build the Mars orbiter into just 18 months. Narasimha says this phenomenon, known as jugaad, plays out from India's slums to its scientific labs.
Frugal innovation. It means that you want to get the most out of the money you put in. And you have to be very clever about it. You think about it, you fix it, you make it work, and get something out of it. And that goes on all the time.
It does go on all the time, and the rest of the world is catching on to it. Just to wind up, big companies in the West are now adding jugaad innovation to their toolkits, keeping it simple, doing it more with less in an age of austerity. So India's population is epic, its problems are epic, and its solutions and its innovations, its ingenuity strikes me on the level of being epic, and others are grabbing this concept of jugaad and running with it. And I will close there, and just to tell you, there is a slideshow that will run as we talk, and it starts out with gold, and all that glitters is gold in India. They have in their safety deposit boxes, under their mattresses, in their jewelry boxes, $800 billion worth of the yellow stuff. And so we'll start out with pictures of those, and then I will go in, the pictures go into the Kumbh Mela, another obsession. There's an obsession with festivals, religious festivals. This is billed as the biggest religious festival in the world. It happens once every 12 years, and I had the honor of going to it last year, and I learned more in those 4 days, I think, than I would in 4 years in India. So here we go. Thank you.
That was great. That was great, Jules. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jules. And we're going to hear from our panelists, and later you'll be able to ask questions as well. And I wanted to, I hope in the next half hour or so, we'll be able to get a sense not just of what India has been like, but what the election of Modi promises for the future. And let me ask Ashley, tell us, first of all, you were an editor and contributor to a collection of essays. I read your introduction. The title is Getting India Back on Track. The title implies something, that things were going better until at some point when they went off the rails. So explain to us, in the Indian experience, what were the recent good old days, or the more hopeful days, what went wrong, and what is hoped to go better?
I think it's a story that can be expressed in 3 phases, at least in the simplest version of the story. From 1947 to about 1991, the Indian economy did not do as well as it should have if it had followed the right economic strategies. Now, that's a huge oversimplification, but I think take it at face value, at least for the moment. In 1991, India was faced with a major balance of payments crisis when the so-called socialist economics that it practiced for the first 40 or so years of its independent life essentially reached the limits of its success. And in 1991, the then finance minister of the day, later the prime minister, Manmohan Singh, began an economic transformation which revolved around slowly moving from what was a state-dominated economy to a market-dominated economy. Now, that transformation just began. And at the pace at which the reforms took place, it was a transformation that would require many, many years to complete. So what happened in 91 was the beginning of a new phase in which Indian economic growth really began to take off. And particularly in the years 2001 to about 2006, 2007, the Indian economy performed at historically abnormally superior rates,
10% annual growth.
close to 10% in that decade.
Between 2000 and 2008, roughly,
Correct.
9 to 10%.
Correct. Now, what happened, unfortunately, in the second term of the Manmohan Singh government, that growth really began to sputter. And India began to hit the low single digits, 4%, 4.5%. And that is the sense of getting off the rails. And Modi's election Modi really gets elected because of the promise that he would resuscitate the economy and take India back to those high single-digit growth rates. And that's really what the Modi promise is meant to be.
Well, as we go along, I'll ask you more about what you expect him to do, but let me ask Ashutosh Varshney. You have observed that the Muslim right and the Hindu right in India always feed off each other. Now that there's a Hindu nationalist prime minister, is it going to be feast or famine for nationalists in India?
Yeah, Mr. Modi clearly, as everybody knows, has a Hindu nationalist background. And there is a very big riot during his chief ministership of the state of Gujarat in 2002. He's not been legally found culpable, incidentally. There have been many cases, but the courts have not found enough evidence that he was involved in any legally culpable manner.
But it was an event that really defined.
But it was an event that defined his image for a long time.
Trajectory.
He's been trying to come out of that. I think most of us would say that it's about 5 or 6 years that he's been trying to reinvent himself as a governance and growth politician.
Governance and growth.
Growth, yes. Deliver governance to India and deliver growth first to his state, and now that was the main campaign theme for the parliamentary elections, national elections. So, but the fact remains that the organization where he spent most of his years and the cadres of that organization are driven by ideology. And that ideology says that Indian nationalist project is not a civic nationalist project. India is owned primarily by Hindus or only by Hindus. And the minorities would have to accept the centrality of Hindus to the Indian nationhood.
Now, you should just remind us here of some astonishing numbers, which is the Muslim community of India is, I gather, after Indonesia and perhaps right up there with Pakistan, it's somewhere tied as the second largest national Muslim community in the world. It accounts for what percent of the population of India?
14% of the population, which would be roughly 150 million now. And depending on how you count, it's either the third largest or the fourth largest. Indonesia, number 1. Bangladesh could be number 2, or Pakistan could be number 2. And they are 2 or 3, and then India is 4th. And
fourth?
It could have left, let's say, Bangladesh behind, because Bangladesh population growth rate has declined seriously. Pakistan population growth rate has not declined that much. So we'll know in the next 4 or 5 years, the ranking might change. But it's a huge Muslim population. The point is a huge Muslim population.
And as a result of that, because there are so many large in their numbers, it allows that Hindu question to press on them in a way it really hasn't pressed so visibly yet on others, on Buddhists, on Christians.
Right. So that's right. Even though this claim that India is a Hindu nation would, of course, exclude Christians, and that's about 2% of India, a very small Jewish community, a small Parsi community, they will all be excluded from not just the Muslims, but Muslims, Hindu-Muslim relationship having been what it's been for 100 years or so, this is the sort of master narrative of Indian politics. When we study American politics, we say race is the master narrative in some ways. So the Hindu-Muslim issue is master narrative of Indian politics. And the cadres are not driven by a statesman-like vision that Mr. Modi might develop or might be developing. Mr. Modi has not made any virulently anti-Muslim statements since the campaign began. Has not. Whereas the cadres are not, they're schooled differently. So the Hindu right then begins to exert itself on the ground. Muslim right reacts, or it could be the other way also in some cities. But they feed off each other. And it's a universal story how the two right wings feed off each other. And this dynamic then may require his serious intervention at some point for it to stop, or might get out of control.
And I think it's important to note that Modi doesn't appear, most recently in the past year, to be a religious zealot.
Right. Correct.
And that, if need be, he could distance himself from the very organization that lifted him up. Because what matters to Modi is power. And you can't maintain power in India if you are splitting the society. That's not how it really works. At a very basic level, an intrinsic level, this society is about tolerance. That's why you have 150 to 170 million Muslims and Buddhists and Christians and Parsis and Hindus living together in what has been, relative peace. So I think Mr. Modi is about power and less about religious zealotry, which may save India.
I'd like to hear first from Ashley Tellis and then from all of you how Modi is seen by the Indian voters who elected him. What are we hear his promises, he will bring growth and governance. What's his appeal? How do you describe it?
So the survey research is pretty clear on this. 25% of those who voted for BJP, the party to which he belongs,
the Hindu Nationalist Party,
did not vote for the party but voted for him.
He's that
every
popular.
fourth voter. Yeah. So every fourth voter that voted for his party voted for him and not for the party. The survey is very clear about that. This 25%, in other words, clearly saw growth, governance, and promise of India's resurrection in Modi. And if Hindu-Muslim violence gets out of control, this 25% will leave him. And that will complicate return to power 5 years from now. Therefore, I agree with Julie that it is in his interest to contain Hindu-Muslim tensions and to contain the cadres. It will hurt him otherwise.
Ashley, tell us, is he a charismatic figure? Does he excite crowds?
He's a remarkably charismatic figure. If you watched the election, this was really charismatic politics in a way that India had not seen since the late 1970s, when Mrs. Gandhi was a similarly positioned individual. This election really was not about the BJP versus the Congress. It was really about Modi.
It was a presidential campaign.
It was a presidential campaign, and people
Meaning to
voted.
say they don't have a presidential system, it's a prime ministerial. In other words, it's about the man rather than the party.
Right. It had all the accoutrement of a presidential campaign. And I think people began to see in Modi as essentially the answer to the kind of promises they hoped the Manmohan Singh government would have left as a legacy, which is sustained economic growth that lifts all up. Now, it's a very important point to keep in mind that the 1991 reforms have actually been a great developmental success in India. A huge section of the population has actually been lifted out of poverty. And so the hope was that if the growth rates that accrued as a result of those reforms were to be sustained consistently, it would really provide new opportunities for this burgeoning young population that Julie reminded us of. And the fact that Manmohan failed provided Modi with the opportunity to then step in and become the legatee of those promises.
Is it clear to both of you, or to all three of you, that the failure of the previous government was programmatic, that it was based on wrong-headed policies, or was it a time of global economic crisis and a very difficult era in which to try to grow, or were the facts just not on India's side? What would you say?
I think that there was so much that had happened in the second term of that government, and not a lot of it was good.
Yeah.
Mega corruption scandals were unearthed. And that cannot be underestimated as a driver in this election. People wanted to throw the rascals out.
This is what governance means.
This is what yes, this is exactly what governance means. And Modi campaigns as the anti-corruption man. And in addition to which, I think this is huge and cannot be underestimated either, a dynasty left the stage. And it does raise the question about dynastic politics way at the top. It happens all over in various elections. Dynastic
Going back to Nehru, you're
Going
saying.
back to Nehru, exactly.
But remember,
In other words, is it over?
the real issue, I think, for the Indian people was performance. That is, India has seen corruption at historically high levels over the years. But when corruption is coupled with complete policy paralysis, where nothing happens, and nothing happens because you have a prime minister who is at loggerheads with the leader of his own party, and is simply unable to govern in a way that people want, then the penalties that corruption imposes on the politic become all the greater. And I think it was the conjunction of acute exemplary corruption on one hand, coupled with simply, patent non-performance on the other, that really creates the conditions for Modi's arrival.
Corruption with high economic growth, frankly, would be tolerable. Corruption with low economic growth is a no-no.
Speaking of which, speaking of corruption with high economic growth, Julie invoked a couple of comparisons with China in her presentation. Do Indians, at least those in policy-making circles, is there a little voice in the back of their head saying, China's doing this, China's doing that, China's doing this, China's doing that? Yes? Yes?
Yes.
You're saying Ashutosh?
I think there are two views about China. They recognize that China is a country to be emulated because China's successes are no longer seen as just accidental. There's something happening there which serves as a mirror for India in its own choices. But there's also a palpable sense of fear about China because there are old rivalries which have only become harder in the last few years. And so there is a peculiar duality in the way Indians look at China. It's an object of envy, but it's at the same time an object of anxiety.
Sure.
I do agree that there's an ambivalence, a deep ambivalence towards China. China and India were roughly at the same level in 1990, per capita, urban, rural distribution, all of that, except China's poverty levels were lower even then. One of the good things about the Maoist period did many bad things. One of the good things it did, it provided sanitation, health, education, and lowered the massive poverty rates of China before the Communist Revolution. So yes, poverty rates were lower, but on the whole, per capita, urban-rural distribution of population roughly the same in 1990. And while India grew fast, after 1990, China grew so much faster.
Yes.
That the compounding of that, if you compound plus 2% each year, or something like that, you begin to get a big difference in the end. And yes, it's an object of envy, but an object of in some ways, anxiety, because the border problem remains unresolved. And even while China's president was in India and talking to Mr. Modi, border skirmish took place. Chinese soldiers moved across the so-called border, line of control. While he's there, while the president was there. So I did an interview actually with one of the leading scholars of Chinese elite politics, Roderick McFarker at Harvard, and for the paper, for the newspaper Indian Express. And he basically said it's impossible. And let's see whether Ashley would agree with this as an expert in strategic issues. McFarker argued it's impossible for Chinese president not to know that the soldiers were crossing the line of control while he was in India. It is impossible. The way this system is set up, without his knowledge, it cannot take place.
So in other words, a message,
a message was
a
sent.
not so subtle message by China is sent to India while the Chinese leader is on Indian soil, that we still control the game. I think that is the message.
Ashley,
that
yes.
China was.
I shake your hand. Oops, I stepped on your toe by coincidence.
There's a fundamental asymmetry in the way China looks at India and India looks at China. I mean, China looks at India as a country with whom they want to have good relations, but not as a peer. Whereas India looks at China as a country that ought to be a peer, except that India's performance has not taken it to the point where it is a peer. And so I have no doubt that even if Xi Jinping didn't know the details of what was going to transpire, the policies that he has put in motion over the last 2 years with respect to protecting China's frontiers almost certainly guaranteed a crisis of this kind.
I should ask about one other country and its relations with India before we take questions from the audience. That is the United States. Actually, you were part of negotiating the nuclear deal with India, in which I gather our government stopped, it abandoned its demands for India to abandon its nuclear weapons program and replaced it with a strong non-proliferation regime where India would agree to very severe export controls. Has a strategic partnership with India developed and matured over the past 10 years?
Well, I would say yes and no. US-Indian relations are today deeper than they have been at any time since 1962. During the Sino-Indian War, when India veered very closely, almost becoming a de facto ally of the United States. That was the last great high point. In the last 10 years, our relations have come incredibly close in a way that was simply unthinkable. But I think a genuine strategic partnership still remains beyond reach. And to my mind, it remains beyond reach fundamentally for structural reasons. The United States is a global power with global interests. India is still a regional power. And there are many issues where we don't see eye to eye because our equities are different. And I think it will be a long while before India acquires both the capacities and the confidence to be able to deal with the United States at a level where it can be a partner, giving some things while still not being seen as a supplicant. And that is really, I think, the task for administrations and governments on both sides in the years to come. But remember, the big transformation has been that we've taken the greatest and most perplexing issue that divided us, which was our troubles with India's nuclear weapons program, and put that behind us forever.
You remind me, and as well as Julie's presentation reminded me, of how while very, very often the discussion of politics, whether on a local or a global level, is about material things and about wealth or even power, dignity is also a currency of political relations, and the dignity of women in rural India, the dignity of nations when they deal with each other is also equally important. Our next guest, by the way, this is not apropos of the panel being about India, but his train is late. So he's a little bit delayed. We have a little bit of extra time, and that gives us time now to take questions from you. There are 2 microphones in the aisle, and we'd welcome your questions about what you've heard or haven't heard. Yes, why don't you go right ahead?
So I was really interested in the toilets, because I've seen sort of these, a lot of like social entrepreneurs coming in. Like I think the pee-poo bag is really interesting. And I don't know if you guys know about that, but it's a bag that is biodegradable, and so it creates soil, and it's environmental. Mm-hmm. But to me, the focus on females with the toilets, I could understand if it was something that had to do with sanitation and health, but it seems to me kind of like a quick fix, and that we're pushing women through having these toilets, or like by pushing women's access to toilets, we're actually pushing women further into the private sphere rather than creating a safe space in the public sphere for women, which a public sphere which has shunned them for a long time. And I just wanted to know more about the work that's being done to make the public sphere a safe place for women. And I also had a question about Ms. McCarthy and any of the other panelists about your views on the third sex, the transgender, in India, because I actually find that a bit problematic. I find it problematic in the sense that that it introduces yet another gender identifier that creates that asserts power over somebody and sort of takes away a freedom of gender expression by identifying it.
Let's begin with the first question about the question raised about the toilets. Julie, did you have a, or
Ashu,
Ashu.
address this.
So modern sanitation, if you look at the history of modern sanitation, it becomes a mass phenomenon essentially around 1890s and 1900. So 1880s is a big development in Britain, then comes to America, spreads to the continent. And I remember a remarkable story that Ezra Vogel, one of the leading scholars of Japan, used to tell his class, which I took when I was a student, that in 1950s Tokyo, every morning he would close his nose like this because it would stink, much of Tokyo. But by the mid-1960s, Tokyo had full modern sanitation within the next 10 years. Because I have Chinese students who grew up here, let's say one in Austin, Texas, who tells the story about her ancestral village, her father's village. So she's American, but her father came from a village 100 miles from Shanghai, which I visited last year. That until roughly 2002, 2003, large parts of China had no modern sanitation. Right? So the point about that is emerging in sanitation studies is that modern sanitation becomes available to masses roughly at when societies reach $4,000 or $5,000 per capita. It's expensive to put modern sanitation in. At low levels of income, Indonesia also has 40% open defecation today. So if we look at it this way, then I think if in the next 10 to 15 years, modern sanitation is not provided to India, then it'll be a very big failure. It is a failure, I think.
Yes.
I think Julie is right to point out, Indian Prime Minister is saying that, experts of health, sanitation basically has become the biggest issue as far as I can tell in public health research now, in the last 5 years or so. And it seems to explain, according to the scholarship emerging, a lot of bad public health outcomes, lack of modern sanitation, right? So I think if you see it this way, then part of the problem is income-based, and part of the problem could be some cultural issues, etc., which we need to talk about, which is what actually the Prime Minister is now frontally attacking, right? The idea of Clean India campaign is also talking about how the habits of Indians. Their homes are clean, but their roads are not clean.
Yeah.
Their homes are clean, but their lanes are not clean. And how to change that. Yeah, so that may be a cultural issue.
Well, which raises the public space distinction.
The public space question, I think if anyone were working in this kind of area in India, they would probably say to you, first things first. Let's get private, let's provide privacy for people in their home or certainly near their home, and that's what women want. This is not a divider of sexes. That's what they want. That's what they want for their children. The men won't mind it, but they don't want to, a lot of times they don't want to spend the money to build a house. For example, we go to a village and we're there with the toilet manufacturer, the social entrepreneur, Mr. Patak, and he pulls the villagers aside and he points to these big houses that are being built. And he said, "Are you building that?" And they said, "Yes," very proudly. He said, "Have you put a toilet in there?" And they say, "Well, no, we don't need one." And he said, you have obviously all this money to spend on building a house, but you don't have the either presence of mind or enough interest in the health of the children here, of the women, of sort of the public here to put a toilet in your house.
Although, Julia, the way we typically think of that is the builder builds the bathroom, the government provides the infrastructure that would deliver water so that you could have a sewage system.
Right. There isn't a sewage system.
Yeah, well, that's
in India.
I also think, though, that the connection, like connecting it directly to going out and risking being raped, while it is a quick fix, obviously, to have a toilet in that sense of safety, at the same time, like, for example, some students at Duke made a nail polish where when you put it in your drink, it can tell, it's a litmus test to see if there's,
Poison.
Rufinol in it. But that's victim
Yeah,
blaming.
yeah.
It's a quick fix, and that's just what I wanted to assert in the association.
But
Thank
on the public sphere issue, you might want to note that 1/3 of all local elected government officials today are women. 1 million out of 3 million, by law, by constitution. And many of them are coming of age in that when they first ran for office, they said they were a substitute for their husbands. But more and more research is saying that they present themselves as themselves now, not everywhere, and not all of them, and not as substitutes for their husbands. Right? So that is another. The gender story becomes full of contradictions again. This is one side of the gender story in India, which is rather remarkable. The other side is what Julie laid out for you, which is unremarkable and is a sign of failure and needs to be tackled.
Let's take another question from the audience. Hi.
Hi. I was very interested in your statement that as long as there's economic growth, you can take a lot of corruption. And it was my understanding.
I think he was characterizing the Indian polity as feeling that. It wasn't a personal expression. Yes.
But it was my understanding that Modi ran on an anti-corruption platform. And I'm just wondering, how much did this corruption in the last administration cause the economic stagnation?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'll answer that with a question, and that is, to what extent did the notion that was telegraphed not just internally but across the world that India was a very bad place to do business because it was not transparent and it was corrupt suppress foreign investment in the country?
It did, substantially.
But I don't think that's the reason for non-performance. I mean, the reason for it was certainly probably contributory, but India is not an economy where, if you look at, say, trade to GDP ratios, where if you get a constriction of foreign trade, it impacts economic performance. It does not have that kind of foreign exposure. The heart of the problem in India was that the government had simply ceased to do what government has to do, which is to make and execute policy. And it ceased to conduct its basic functions because the leader of the Congress party, Sonia Gandhi, and the leader of the government, Manmohan Singh, did not have a common view about what the policy of this government had to be. Sonia Gandhi had a different vision. Manmohan Singh had a different vision. And Manmohan Singh had the more progressive vision, but unfortunately did not have the power to execute it. And it was really the rumblings within the Congress party and the government that created the foundations for a paralysis that led up to the economic failures of the second term. Everything else, to my mind, is peripheral. The global economic slowdown was peripheral. The issues of corruption magnified public resentment against the government, but they were not causally responsible for the slowdown. And I think the big point about corruption in India is you've got to be careful when one talks about it, because there are different kinds of corruption. The kinds of corruption that people react to was the very conspicuous corruption with respect to vested interests locking in very large natural resource claims. So the auction of spectrum, the auction of coal blocks, these are huge natural resource assets which were transferred to vested interests in a less than transparent fashion. But this is not the kind of corruption that affects the man in the street. What affects the man in the street is what do you think of as petty corruption, which is pervasive, right? You need to get a birth certificate when your kid is born in a hospital. And you cannot get a birth certificate without bribing the clerk to give you one. You're stopped by an arrogant and avaricious policeman on the street who cites you, whether there was a violation or not, simply because he wants to accept a bribe. Now, the stories of Indians having to deal with petty corruption is legion. So when you actually test people about corruption, you really get different stories because they're affected by different forms of corruption. So there's no universal, one-size-fits-all corruption story that accounts for.
Let's try to get in another question from our audience.
Thank you. Charlie Kirker from Middlebury, Vermont. To what extent did Modi, either as a candidate or now as Prime Minister, speak to issues of climate change and the sources of fuel in a growing India, because certainly with so many of their cities and tens upon millions of people living at or close to sea level, that's going to be a growing issue for the country. Given the poverty, I'm sure it's a tough issue to address, but I'm wondering, has that factored into the thinking of this new government at all?
On the whole, he did not, but there's one issue he emphasized a lot, which was cleaning the Ganga River.
Ganges.
Cleaning the Ganges. Mm-hmm. And Ganges in English, Ganga in Hindi. And so the cleaning India's biggest river is a huge project. And it has all kinds of positive environmental consequences if it does happen. But that was, in fact, I was present in an election speech he gave in actually the city from where he ran for one of the two constituencies from where he ran. So I was there. It's the holiest city of India for Hindus, or one of the holiest cities, arguably the holiest city, the city of Varanasi, where the 45-minute speech, election speech, 42 Celsius, everybody's sweating, and Mr. Modi is still raring to go. His sixth speech of the day, no sign of fatigue. And 1/3 of the speech was about cleaning the Ganga and the plan for that. 1/3 of the speech was about how to connect the weavers. It has a small textile industry.
Weavers, yeah.
How to bring them to the world markets. And 1/3 was an attack on the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. Right. But Ganga, cleaning the Ganga, took 1/3 of the time, of course, and it's a big part of his campaign, was a big part of his campaign, and is a big part of his current sort of plan as a prime minister. Other than that, he has not talked about environment.
Other than that, no. I think we've run up against our time limit. We have time for one more question.
One more.
Good.
Thank you.
Hi.
I'd like to hear you discuss the impact of Modi's election combined with the abandonment of nuclear negotiations on Indian-Pakistani relationship.
Well, it began with a bang, no pun intended, and one that people felt very happy about. I mean, there was Nawaz Sharif at the inauguration of Narendra Modi.
Did you expect that?
Yeah.
Did I expect that? No, I didn't expect that. So it was unexpected, and all of these unexpected sort of positive things came out of it. But it didn't take long for that relationship to sour.
With Pakistan, you're saying?
With Pakistan, yes, the Pakistani-Indian relationship to sour after really putting out this very positive feeler that maybe things will get back on track and that these nuclear rivals will find a way forward. But now I think we're back to where things were, and that's very troubling.
Let me say a couple of things on this. He started out in ways that really surprised everyone. And the decision that he made to invite the South Asian leaders to his inaugural was his decision alone. There was terrific pressure from people around him, including from the Hindu nationalist base, not to engage in this kind of outreach. He made the decision, and he invited Sharif and many others to the meeting. That meeting that they had, which was a private one-on-one meeting, he actually had all the aides leave the room, was a remarkable meeting. It lasted for much longer than it was planned, and they really had a conversation politician to politician. Now, what happened? What happened was he thought he had set new ground rules for how India and Pakistan would conduct business in the months ahead. And the principal ground rule was, let's make progress on the issues where we can, which is primarily trade and economic, and keep the political disagreements, in a sense, in abeyance until we can make sufficient progress to be able to deal with them. That was the broad understanding that Modi wanted to convey. Now, unfortunately for Modi, Sharif is not in a position to be able to deliver consistent with this promise. Because Sharif is not the master of his own house. When he goes back to Islamabad, no matter what he says in Delhi, he has to deal with what might crudely be called the deep state in Pakistan, which is essentially the Pakistani military. And the Pakistani military sees as the kiss of death any economic improvements with India that do not satisfy their geopolitical ambitions with respect to Kashmir and everything else. And so what happened was, after Sharif gets back from what was a successful meeting with Modi, the military reels him in and literally prevents him from making good on the commitments. Now, this has immediately a ricochet effect, because then Modi looks at Sharif and says, how am I to deal with a partner who is simply incapable of making good on his promises? And so we get now into this very subversive and corrosive environment where both sides are engaged in a nasty tit-for-tat along the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir.
Ashur, did you have something to say?
When Modi rose to power, some people thought this could be a Nixon in China moment.
Mm-hmm. The Hindu nationalist.
That Democrats couldn't deliver China, but only Republicans could, because Democrats were suspect, right? So Congress is always suspect, Congress party in India. BJP has, on this issue, you wouldn't suspect it to make compromises, right? However, the Nixon in China moment also requires a Mao, not only Nixon. Mm-hmm. Mao could deliver China, Nawaz Sharif cannot deliver Pakistan. Only the military can, is the logic of that. Therefore, it didn't turn out to be a Nixon in China moment. Modi had the power to deliver, but Nawaz Sharif did not have the power to deliver.
So
now
they're
remember,
talking
this
to the
is
wrong
a
people.
Structural problem that's not going away. India's natural interlocutors, which are the civilian government, turn out to be nice guys to do business with, but ineffectual. The real interlocutors that India must deal with, which is the Pakistani military, is the one institution that has no interest in making peace with India. Because peace with India actually puts them out of business, right? And so that is a natural structural contradiction that even Mr. Modi, with all his capacity to, take great initiatives, cannot overcome.
And Pakistan's military is in business, from insurance companies to banking to fertilizing. And if they go out of business, or if they are somehow constricted, a lot of those people who have been enriched will no longer be enriched. So there's a real vested interest to keep the conflict going.
Well, and these fascinating, if not entirely encouraging observations, I'm going to bring our panel to a close. Ashley, Talas, Ashutosh Rajni, Julian McCarthy, thank you.